Welcome to the Cardboard Crash Course. My name's Ethan, and today we're going to be talking about the Nomad faction. This is a faction from the Prophecy of Kings expansion for Twilight Imperium 4th edition. This is kind of a strange faction in lore, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but mainly this is going to be a component overview and an analysis of how to play. If you love these videos, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. We're almost to 1,000 subscribers, and I absolutely love the idea of building this community together. If you love it just a little bit more, join the Discord or check out the Patreon. But before further ado, let's go ahead and check it out. We start with the Nomad's faction sheet. Recently, right before the Kraus expedition that reawoken the PoK, a signal was sent from the center of the galaxy where no life should exist. In ancient radio frequencies, telling of the PoK's reawakening. This, of course, was thought to be impossible, but after this event, people began to see the Nomad on every corner of the galaxy, a very wealthy and secretive person, or possibly many people, who leads a small team which he calls the Cavalry. The Nomad is in all places at once and always knows what's going to happen before it happens. Whether it be time travel or predictive intelligence, we'll never know. But one thing is for certain, the Nomad is not a force to be messed with. So, how does the Nomad start in the actual game of Twilight Imperium? Let's go ahead and move directly into their starting planet. This is Arcturus, the home system. It is a 4-resource and 4-influence planet. Really a powerful way to start and sets them up for success right away. 4 resources and 4 influence is a great set and really allows you a lot of flexibility in building your fleet. But what's interesting about the Nomad is that their fleet is sort of already built from the get-go, for the most part. Their starting units consist of 1 flagship, 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 3 fighters, 4 infantry, and a space dock. You'll notice right away that this is the first faction to actually begin with their flagship. This flagship is no ordinary flagship, and when we get to the units, we'll speak about that as well. Of course, it only does have the single carrier, but it does begin with 4 infantry, and that 4 resources from your home system should make that up for it. Now moving into what else they start with. They do, of course, get 1 generic technology called Sling Relay to begin. This is a new technology from Prophecy of Kings, and it has a blue prerequisite, and it gives a blue. And it has the action, exhaust this card to produce 1 ship in any system that contains one of your space docks. This, of course, is an ability that is useful to any race, but as we'll talk about, it is especially useful to them. Now, before we get into any other cards, let's go ahead and discuss the abilities right on their faction sheet. They do, of course, have 4 commodities, which is sort of an ability all in itself. With that higher commodity value, they're allowed to make a lot of commodities every time they refresh, and allows them to be a really good trade partner throughout the game. Now, the first ability is called the Company, and it's not really an ability, more of just a setup. During setup, take the 2 additional Nomad faction agents and place them next to your faction sheet. You have 3 agents. This sort of makes it up because the lack of 1 ability is sort of giving you 3 more, and we'll discuss those in a minute. But the other ability right on the faction sheet is Future Sight. This says, during the agenda phase, after an outcome you voted for or predicted is resolved, gain 1 trade good. This is just kind of a little bit of a passive ability, but everything that we're seeing here has hidden meanings behind it, and other cards will unlock better and better versions of them. So including Future Sight, we'll be able to double, if not triple, the amount that we make from that. Now, without further ado, let's move on to the exciting flagship, the Memoria 1. This is an 8-cost, 7x2 combat, 1 movement, and 3 capacity flagship with sustained damage and anti-fighter barrage 8x3. Now, this is already an incredibly good stat block for a flagship, especially one that you start off with right away. As we'll see, it also does have an ability. This says, you may treat this unit as if it were adjacent to systems that contain 1 or more of your mechs. So this allows you to jump around the board similar to a Kraus ability, and lets the flagship be in anywhere that it needs to be. So as we'll see here, this is also the only faction to be able to upgrade their flagship. And the upgrade looks a little something like this. This is Memoria 2. It requires a green, blue, and yellow prerequisite. and still costs 8, but it upgrades to a 5x2 combat, movement of 2, and capacity of 6, with sustained damage still, but the anti-fighter barrage goes from 8x3 to 5x3, and it also has the same ability as the first flagship. This is insane. This is pushing War Sun levels of power, and the Memoria 2 is not something to mess around with on your opponent's side. So speaking about that mech we can be carrying around, let's go ahead and look at that card next. We've got a cost of 2 and a combat value of 6 with sustained damage. This is pretty average for a mech, but the ability is really unique. It says, while this unit is in a space area during combat, you may use its sustained damage ability to cancel a hit that is produced against your ships in this system. So this is not only a great way to protect yourself on the ground, but also assists your ships in space combat. Really a flexible ability. So of course the Memoria 2 takes up one of the faction technologies, but let's look at the other one now. This requires one yellow prerequisite and is called Temporal Command Suite. This says after any player's agent becomes exhausted, you may exhaust this card to ready that agent. If you ready another player's agent, you may perform a transaction with that player. So even if they're not your neighbor, you can trade with them if you help them out. Keep in mind you can always use this on yourself, and you have 3 agents to pick from, which we'll go ahead and look at next. First of all is the Thunderian. These 3 agents all start unlocked and begin next to each other on your faction sheet. This one in particular says after the roll dice step of combat, you may exhaust this card. If you do, hits are not assigned to either player's units. Return to the start of this combat round's roll dice step. This essentially rolls back any combat round in which you lost. This can completely reset your ability to fight again, especially including ships such as your flagship. The second agent is Field Marshal Mercer. Try to say that 10 times fast. At the start of a player's turn, you may exhaust this card to allow that player to remove up to 2 of their ground forces from the game board and place them on planets they control in the active system. So this allows some serious flexibility with both your ground forces as well as being able to sell it to other people that may be helped more by it. Imagine selling this to an Arborec player where their infantry placement means that much more than yours does. Field Marshal Mercer, I think, is the one you'll be trying to sell out the most. And moving on to the third and final agent, this is Artuno the Betrayer. In my opinion, definitely the strongest. This card says, when you gain trade goods from the supply, you may exhaust this card to place an equal number of trade goods on this card. When this card readies, gain the trade goods on this card. A lot of cards on that card, but what it basically means is that you can double or even triple utilizing the Temporal Command Suite to be able to create so much revenue with the Nomad. But those aren't the only leaders. We also have the Commander, Navark Fang. This unlocks when you have 1 scored secret objective. So he's always doing those sort of secretive things and even benefits off of them. When it does unlock, Navark Fang gives you the passive ability, you can produce your flagship without spending resources. So you still have to activate a space dock or however you're going to produce it, maybe Sling Relay, but Navark Fang allows you to not pay that 8 cost that it says, which I think you should never be paying. And lastly, moving on to the hero. This is Anksil Sivan and unlocks when you have 3 scored objectives. He gives you the ability Probability Matrix. As an action, you can place this card near the game board. Your flagship and units it transports can move out of systems that contain your command tokens during this game round. At the end of that game round, purge this card. So from your very first round or wherever you'd like to activate that, you can allow your flagship to score any objectives that may require it to be in specific situations. Now, we'll talk about that more when we talk about all these cards in just a moment. But the final card that he has is, of course, the Promissory Note. This is a card that you give out to other players for them to use for themselves. This is called the Cavalry. During this combat, treat one of your non-fighter ships as if it has the sustained damage ability, combat value, and anti-fighter barrage value of the Nomad's flagship. Return this card to the Nomad player at the end of combat. So that is very important that specifies that you can do it only against people that are not the Nomad. This is sort of the Nomad helping out in your fight and being able to teleport as he does. The Cavalry is another card we'll talk about in depth in the analysis. All of these cards really mold together into one powerful synergy, and we'll go ahead and talk about that now. So, the Nomad is really one of those factions that made me interested in the Prophecy of Kings expansion as soon as it was announced, because it's just so much different having a single person inside of his flagship and his 5 leaders helping him out, instead of like a whole faction, a whole race of beings fighting against each other. The Nomad had such unique mechanics, and the fact that he can upgrade his flagship and he starts with his flagship on the board, I just got so excited to play him. But I haven't really played him quite as much as I thought I would. Now, he's a little bit different than he first comes across. We have a couple competing elements here. The commander, once it's unlocked by having a secret objective, which, by the way, is kind of random. It's sort of difficult to unlock that early on when you want it, because you do want to be using your flagship in combat pretty much as soon as you can, because you are superior right off the bat. But that being said, that ability to be able to produce without spending resources is really contradictory to how I think the Nomad truly turned out in his mechanics. Artuno the Betrayer, which is the agent that allows you to put trade goods on her when you gain trade goods, is probably second to Hakan, one of the best bank or trade good abilities in the game. This, of course, is not quite as powerful than the Mentak technology that allows you to double your trade goods, because it doesn't happen every single time, only once per phase. But keep in mind that this does work in both the strategy and the status phase, because all cards refresh twice. So when you're gaining that trade good from Future Sight, you do get to double it with Artuno the Betrayer anyway, if you're not already having a better option to get even more trade goods. He really, after the agenda phase unlocks, becomes so much better of a faction because you just get so many resources. So Artuno the Betrayer kind of makes the Nomad into a bank, and I don't think that's how people intend to play him when first starting off. Now, I did say that he has some military might early in the game. This is of course true. Starting with the flagship, the Memoria is such a powerful combative flagship, and even being able to move it around with your mechs as soon as the game begins sets you up to be able to explore out to planets, drop down your mechs, and keep them ready to be able to participate in space combat to protect that flagship as it goes through the space combat rounds. Now, of course, you don't truly care if your flagship is the one to get destroyed as compared to like a Dreadnought, or if you for some reason went into War Sun with him, but it is quite a hit because you do still have to move it back out there if you don't have a mech. If you do have a mech, I would say that producing your flagship over and over is not that big of a deal with him. Because you get so many trade goods, something like Leadership Secondary or even Primary is sort of a joke with him. You do get to spend so much influence in trade goods to get those command counters that it isn't that crazy of a command counter investment to produce your flagship over and over again. I think this really creates a good sort of machine with that flagship creation, but I don't really think that once you upgrade the flagship, you should be utilizing it for combat all the time. What I found is the Thunderian, the one that lets you reroll dice, shouldn't really be relied on as a perfect way to fix your combat. This is just a little bit of help in a situation where you might be attacked without knowing it, but don't rely on it to protect you and save you at a moment's notice. And Field Marshal Mercer, wow, I had to take that take like 7 times. And Field Marshal Mercer is not too great of an ability for you. I wouldn't rely on it to lock down planets like you think you may be able to. Keep in mind, without Temporal Command Suite, you're only able to use these agents once per round still. There are 3 of them, but that does come with a detriment of only having 1 true faction ability. I would say I wouldn't rely on the Nomad to be a ground force race, and if you're trying to take Mechatol with him, you're really underutilizing what you can truly do in space combat to take objectives. Now, if none of the public objectives have to do with being on the edge of the game board or being in specific systems or anything, then I say go for it. But I would really focus on objectives first with him, as you really should with every faction. Mechatol can be an afterthought, and if you truly want to move out to Mechatol, you don't really have a ship right away that can get there, and I don't think that Warfare Round 1 is really what you should be going for with the Nomad. So that's a lot of what you shouldn't do. Now, what do I think you should do? Well, it all depends on whether you have a yellow tech skip near your home system to begin with. If you do, then claim it as soon as possible, and that would be the situation in which warfare would be beneficial. Getting temporal command suites as quick as possible is going to save you in the game in the long run. It's of course diminishing returns to get this later, because every time you can ready your agent, especially Artuno the Betrayer, is another time that you could be making money, and a lot of it. If you gain trade and you get those trade goods directly off the card, and that's all you're doubling with Artuno, imagine using that with Temporal Command Suite. All of a sudden you have 10 plus trade goods passively. And I mean truly passively. No other player is going to get upset at you for simply using your passive ability to gain more and more trade goods. They might see you as more of a threat, but this doesn't make enemies right away. I would say that Nomad is probably the best race at making money without taking advantage of others. So utilize that. You can protect yourself. You could make enemies early on with your flagship if you need to for objectives, but I would say try to keep away from most of the other players and simply just do your own thing until you have your hero unlocked. Especially with new players, they aren't going to be expecting that crazy burst with the flagship, and you can bring around quite a bit more than anybody could imagine. You have 6 capacity with that flagship, a movement of 2, and it makes sense for them to go into Fighter 2 with a green and blue skip. Like I said, if you have a yellow skip right away, get Temporal Command Suite, and then move into that green skip, which I would say should be hypermetabolism for them, because you can never have enough command counters with that flagship hero. Go ahead and get the Memoria 2 and then Fighter 2 immediately. Having 6 Fighter 2s as a cushion around that flagship is going to protect it. And although I say that you can keep producing it and it's not a big deal, you shouldn't want to lose it. It is still a command counter you can use for that hero, and every one that you don't use buffs that hero to an unimaginable power, especially to grab a late Stage 2 objective later in the game. So I'm kind of beating around the bush with this. Ultimately, the Nomad should be utilizing combat in very specific situations. Don't be picking fights randomly without an objective in mind, and don't be making enemies because you can make all the money in the world without doing so. You can even give out the cavalry promissory note over and over and over again. A lot like the Yin Brotherhood, they have no reason not to sell this promissory note. It specifically says, not against the Nomad player, and gives them a huge buff in combat. You could even use this during a specific time where you give it out, they use it against another player, and then you come in and gut what's left over. Now, this goes against my philosophy of not making enemies with them, but who cares when it's the last round? Unless, of course, your friends are one of those that'll hold grudges from the previous games. So this hero can do some crazy things, and you're really set up from the very beginning of the game because they have 4 resources and 4 influence. There really is no need for them to have such high commodities, high resources, and high ways to make good amounts of trade goods. They are just simply so good at making a lot of plastic and buying a lot of command counters. I think their entire strategy sort of builds up in the snowball effect to that hero, and being able to move a flagship and 6 other ships with it, including what are possibly mechs that can cancel a hit in space combat, is going to swing the game and make you come out of nowhere at the very late game, and you could get 2, 3, 4, 5 points in a single round, especially if you get the Crown and Tomb of Amphidia. Now, I try not to talk about specific relics and cards and exploration and everything in these videos because every game is so wildly different. But I would like to point the Tomb and the Crown out specifically because the Nomad is sort of one of the only factions that if they're locked away from this, they can still take it out of nowhere. Absolutely take advantage of that and give a big swing in the late game. This perfectly encapsulates their lore and their ability to just pop out of nowhere, because you're hiding in the back, you're making those trade goods and everything, and then all of a sudden you flip your hero and it is just chaos. All the while helping your neighbors out, giving away this promissory note, and hurting the people on the other side of the game board. So as far as strategy cards go, I don't think they should waste their time with leadership unless you have a specific plan, because even just utilizing their secondary of leadership, especially in mid to late game, is good enough for them. I do think you should be taking trade right off the bat, because doubling it with Artuno, and especially the single round where you unlock the Temporal Command Suite for the first time, you should absolutely be stalling, unlock Temporal, and then move into using trade. And you can even be helping out other players, because whether or not they create a big army, you are able to sort of teleport around the board and get away from them, no problem at all. I don't think Imperial is that big of a deal for them, but I do think that technology is where you should be putting the most amount of your efforts. If you can grab technology multiple turns in a row, you're going to be so set up. If you don't start with that yellow tech skip or even a green tech skip, then technology is going to be that much more important. If you don't start with a yellow tech skip, don't waste your time with Sarween tools. Go directly into that Scanlink drone network and just continue to explore those planets, gaining resources off of them. Every faction has a need for Sarween tools, but them least of all. Don't underestimate that flagship, but especially don't underestimate their ability to be the biggest banking system in the game. All 5 of them. If you like this video, go ahead and like it and subscribe. And like I said, we do have a Discord where we have a Twilight Imperium channel and all sorts of board game content that you can go ahead and talk with others about. Without further ado, have a great rest of your day. Pax Magnifica, Bellum Gloriosum.